It's truly a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. John Mills, a psychologist, a psychoanalyst, and a philosopher. John holds 2 doctorates and 2 diplomates in clinical psychology and psychoanalysis, and I have great respect for John. I first met him as a colleague where we both served on the American Board and Academy of Psychoanalysis, and I was surprised to learn ultimately of John's interest in Jung, and I began to read some of his many publications and books. And many of our overlapping interests led to an ongoing friendship. He's made many contributions to Jungian thought, and his sophisticated revisioning of a number of Jung's important ideas are very promising and helpful to the thinking through of Jung's work. In the process, John and I have become friends, and I had the privilege of publishing a paper in his wonderful book on Jung and philosophy, and look forward to our ongoing collaboration and to his talk today on Transcendence.
Well, thanks, my friend. I really appreciate that, and the feeling's mutual. I have a tendency to write very dense papers, and I remember Roger telling me in Cape Town he didn't understand a damn thing I said at the talk. So what I've tried to do was make this 30-some page paper more digestible and accessible. So here it goes. I once had a patient who was run over as a pedestrian by a drunk driver. He was walking on the sidewalk when suddenly a car jumped the curb and mowed over the right side of his body. Now he was lucky to still be able to walk, but he was functionally disabled and he lived in chronic pain. Traumatized and depressed, ironically, he about drank himself to death to cope. One evening, I received a call from the hospital saying my patient was in emergency. When I saw him on the gurney, he was almost in a coma. He drank a half gallon of vodka, hoping to die. Now, being 6 foot 4 inches tall and weighing 260 pounds, he was once again lucky to be alive. When he got out of the psychiatric unit, he started attending AA and support groups sponsored by clergy. He was then invited to attend a weekend retreat at a country property owned by a Christian organization that helped those recovering from addictions. He stayed in his room and he cried all day, coming out only for meals. In a particularly vulnerable moment, he walked outside and he started praying to God, asking for strength and to show him a sign. At the moment he thought this in his mind, a Canadian maple leaf fell from the sky and landed on his shoulder, resting there peacefully. Touched by the hand of God, he wept for joy. Now, we may refer to this as a synchronized event that was both numinous and transcendent, where meaning and emotion were married through the mysterium tremendum, that sense of awe and illumination that emerges from the dark ground of spirit, an ecstasy born of suffering, where the sick soul pines for relief from our being toward pathos. In Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, Jung tells us of how in 1944 he broke his foot and then suffered a heart attack, followed by deliriums, visions, and a near-death experience. Confined to his bed and on the verge of dying, unsure if he was in a dream or a state of euphoria, he described floating out in space. Far below, he quotes, "Far below I saw the globe of the earth, bathed in a glorious blue light. I saw the deep blue sea and the continents, end quote. Now keep in mind, this was in 1944, decades before humanity saw any pictures from space. The famous so-called blue marble photo of the Earth, when it was seen for the first time as a complete sphere, appeared in 1972 during the Apollo 17 mission. It's perhaps surprising to recall that it is only in the last 50 years that we have been able to see the Earth as a whole. In what appears to be a life review flashing before his very eyes, everything fell away, as he said, yet something remained. It was as if I now carried along with me everything I had ever experienced or done, which left a great fullness. There was no longer anything I wanted or desired. I had everything that I was, and that was everything. I would know what had been before me, why I had come into being, and where my life was flowing, end quote. That is, until his doctor floated up from the earth, telling him that he must return. Then his vision ceased. Deflated and forlorn, having been robbed of his destiny, Jung fell into despair. Yet toward the evening, he would fall asleep and wake, quote, in an utterly transformed state. It was as if I were in an ecstasy. I felt as though I were floating in space, as though I were safe in the womb of the universe, in a tremendous void, but filled with the highest possible feeling of happiness. This is eternal bliss, I thought. This can't be described. It's far too wonderful. He continues, these were ineffable states of joy. All these experiences were glorious. Night after night, I floated in a state of purest bliss, thronged round with images of all creation. Gradually, the motifs mingled and paled. Usually the visions lasted for about an hour. Then I would fall asleep again. It's impossible to convey the beauty and intensity of emotion during those visions. They were the most tremendous things I've ever experienced. End quote. Now, these autobiographical narratives are impregnated with the glory of transcendence, of emotional and aesthetic rapture, of spiritual union with the collective and the cosmic, a numinosity like no other. Jung was called back to finish his life work, to complete his individuation, including his research in alchemy, the self, and the mysterium cognitionis. But in his reflections on these events, he added, quote, it was not a production of imagination. The visions and experiences were utterly real. There was nothing subjective about them. They all had a quality of absolute objectivity, end quote. Of course, the philosopher and classical psychoanalyst would be more dubious. From the soulless scientist to the Gnostic, how do we go about objectively affirming psychic experience? Here is an ontological status of bliss pointing to the true nature of reality. Jung gives us a clue. It's about the qualia of lived experience. But Jung does not question whether these transcendental states could be due to his illness, deliriums, or wishful hallucinations mediated by unconscious fantasy, what Winnicott infamously attributed to an underlying psychosis. And as Freud reminds us, quote, if one man has gained an unshakable conviction of the true reality of religious doctrines from a state of ecstasy, which has moved him deeply, of what significance is that to others? End quote. But this seems to be precisely the point. When we are deeply moved, we christen that state of ecstasy with a reality of absolute objectivity. For our purposes, we may bracket the metaphysical questions of whether they exist as mind-independent, extant occasions external to the psyche, because what we are interested in here is the phenomenology of lived experience as esse in anima, being in soul. Here, the qualitative felt variation of interiority as process is what constitutes the backdrop of our investigation into the transcendental, what we confer when experienced with its own objectivity. That is, the affirmative presence of objects and events before our consciousness. I believe this is in part what Jung was trying to convey, yet it does have some supernatural overtones. But whether based in naturalized psychology or not, the presence of being through appearance discloses a certainty pervading our psychic reality, regardless of our mediating unconscious dynamics. Many scholars have analyzed Jung's concept of the transcendent function, but relatively little has been written on Jung's notion of transcendence in general. Perhaps this is implied. But what does appear in the literature tends to center around his conceptions of theology, inherited from Neoplatonism. Actually, David Henderson's written on that, who's probably in attendance. Medieval scholasticism, John White has written on that. To his own Christian upbringing, studies in alchemy, Stan Marlin, and his psychologization of religion, its application to psychotherapy, and the pursuit of wholeness, which is closely related to the quest for the numinous, hence highlighting Jung's indebtedness to Rudolf Otto. But the nature of transcendence is to be found in the very process of individuation itself amorphous and opaque, if not radically subjective, which is further closely tied to the psychological functions it serves, a process at work in both therapy and life. Jung at times collapses the meaning of transcendence into a myriad of different phenomena he tended to examine psychologically, hence obfuscating the term by its general usage or imprecision of what it is supposed to signify. At times he equates images and symbols as transcendental. At other times he associates transcendence with transitions, transformations, and unification principles. He also attributes the transcendent to divinity, the unconscious, and the self, with a big S. We may readily see how this can become confusing depending upon what definition we adopt. For example, symbolic images may be transcendental, but not necessarily transcendent. While symbols may facilitate psychological transformations, they're not the same thing as a transcendent reality. Still, at other times, and more consistently, Jung reifies archetypes and the collective unconscious, which are tantamount to the transcendent, if not relegated to the celestial heavens. Archetypes are both transcendent and transcendental by virtue of the fact that they're posited to condition conscious experience and stand in relation to archaic ontology as the reiteration and return of origins. Equally, when Jung refers to the terms transcendent and function, he juxtaposes an ontological state or condition with an active teleological process encompassing an implied aim, what he refers to as the transition from one condition to another. But a transition does not necessarily mean transcendence, nor does transformation, mediation, or unification. Furthermore, the transcendent function may be said to be operative in the pursuit of transcendence, but transcendence does not necessarily belong to the function itself. With these conundrums in mind, let us set out to understand what Jung means by these notions and experiences of the transcendent and the transcendental. The term transcendence has a convoluted semiotic past, particularly in philosophy and religion. Jung applies the notion in a psychological sense rather than a logical or a metaphysical one. For our purposes, it might be useful to offer an operational definition of the terms transcendent, transcendence, and transcendental, so we may differentiate these discrete conditions and categories, although they remain ontologically interrelated. The term transcendent often relates to a state or condition of having achieved an elevated ontological status of value in potentia or actuality. Transcendence is often thought of as a pursuit or a process of achieving a transcendent state or reality, while transcendental often refers to psychic structures that make transcendence and transcendent possible. As with the motive properties of archetypes, it's often the quality of the lived experience that defines the phenomenology of transcendence. The word transcendence has an encumbered history. Here I wish to confine its meaning to the psychological parameters that describe a qualitative state of rising above or surpassing certain felt limitations to reason and experience. So, from Latin, transcendere, to climb over. What we may properly attribute to more exalted human emotions and find higher spiritual value, meaning, and purpose in the synthetic unifying functions of moral, aesthetic, and rational self-conscious life. Here, transcendence may be defined as the possibility of thought achieving its unitive aim through these modal forms, culminating in higher degrees of consciousness, usually accompanied by sublime valuation and intense emotional satisfaction. But transcendence hardly needs to be confined to an exclusive position of positive value. Conflict and negativity is often the vehicle to transcendental realms, such as in the experience of a majestic dread that sometimes accompanies numinosity. Jung follows in the philosophical tradition of transcendental idealism, generally introduced in the late modern period from Kant and extending into the German idealism movement, exemplified by the transcendental systems of Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, and to some degree Schopenhauer and von Hartmann. Transcendental idealism is generally concerned with the ground, scope, and limits of consciousness and epistemology. However, unconscious processes largely condition how experience is derived. So forms of unconsciousness are epitomized by let's say, the transcendental unity of apperception in Kant, or the self-positing self in Fichte, intellectual intuition in Schelling, unconscious spirit in Hegel, and the primacy of the will in Schopenhauer and von Hartmann. All of these systems of transcendental idealism articulate an archetypal knowing, a knowing that is self-constituting as it cognizes. In a more generic sense, these doctrines attempt to describe and elaborate on the unconscious structural conditions necessary for experience to arise, without which nothing would experientially exist. Here, any view of reality is shaped by the operations of mind, so psyche is presupposed to exist as the apparatus that conditions the ground and proviso for experience to transpire, rooted in an unconscious ontology. What this means is that the unconscious is required in order to give rise to reality. And the only access we have to information about the real is fashioned through the mediation of mind. These unconscious a priori stipulations, by definition, make the psyche a transcendental process. Jung's 1916 paper, The Transcendent Function, written after his break with Freud and during his so-called confrontation period, lay dormant for decades, buried in his files until his students discovered the manuscript and distributed it for publication in 1957. That's how long. He didn't want it out. In his 1958 revision and prefatory note published in the Collected Works, Jung believes it was the foundational precursor to his method of active imagination, whose trajectory is oriented toward an integration of the personality as a whole. We now know that this was conceived and executed during his visionary experiments and inner dialogues in the Red Book. This is a seminal early work that's closely related to the question and process of individuation and the psychological quest for holism, which focuses on the dialectical tension of opposites, of one-sidedness, compensation, and balance within his conceptualization of the self as a developmental pursuit of the numinous within a trajectory toward achieving a unifying, totalizing, or refined personality, namely the synthesis of soul. We may immediately question whether this form of unification and holism is possible, but the notion of a psychic function that leads to the experiential lived reality of a phenomenal felt transcendence within the subject harbors qualitative psychological spiritual value. For Jung, the transcendent function was posited as arising from, as I mentioned earlier, the union of conscious and unconscious contents, and as an attempt to wrestle with the abyss of contradictions that lie within the psyche, specifically the autonomous nature of the unconscious that fuels and sustains these contradictions. Contradictions in the psyche lead to dialectical tensions that can potentially be brought into dialogue with one another through self-conscious reflection or therapy, which can modify the conflicting standpoints, according to Jung, through comparison, exchange, to distinguish them clearly from one another, as he would put it. The point for Jung is that no one can deny contradictions in the psyche, in the stratified levels and the parallel processes of both conscious and unconscious life, nor deny the other within us the right to exist. Elsewhere, Jung states, quote, "There are two and mutually contradictory views eagerly advocating on either side," end quote. Sometimes opposites are simply held in tension with each other or in suspension or abeyance, hence allowed a coexistence. Or they are transformed through confrontation with each other, which allows for a creative movement out of the suspension that leads to a new inner process or situation where opposites are conjoined or integrated, what Jung equates with, quote, wholeness and freedom, end quote. Here we may observe simpatico with Hegel. Now, this early essay foretells Jung's more mature work on the conundrum and resolution of opposition, exemplified in his preoccupation with the coincidence of opposites and their complexity, hence giving rise to complementarity, tensions, conflicts, compensation, and their conjunction, therefore leading toward their union as balancing activities of the psyche, teleologically oriented toward achieving and cultivating an integrated sense of self. Although we may question, once again, the possibility of a synthesis of internal opposition that leads to a greater principle of unity through the sublation of soul. Jung always maintained that the individuation process was a singular journey that was oriented toward greater self-awareness and actualization peculiar to each person, an idiosyncratic process of inner liberation and meaning, never a preordained destination. The only thing that's unavoidable, fated, or inescapable is our encounter with contradiction. Like the intensities of archetypes, the transcendent function is highly associated with the presence and the transformation of affect, particularly guilt, which produces its own qualities and ideals. As with the numinous, the transcendent function can be considered a category of values. It's here where the qualia of the lived experience finds qualitative value in emotional, aesthetic, ethical, and spiritual transcendence that's constellated in consciousness and archetypal process. Jung argues that his method of active imagination is often in the service of the transcendent function as a desired goal. As a psychological process, active imagination is employed to confront the tension of opposites. As one method, one searches for contraries in the form of unconscious will and recognizes such counterpositions in one's interiority, which results in two, conflict, or mutual oppositions within the conscious and unconscious mind. This then leads to a transition manifested as three, symbol, that performs the function of four, unifying the opposites. We may further break this down as a process where A, discrete moments of confrontation with internal self states lead to B, micro conflicts between each other that are alleviated by C, an emerging unifying symbol that D blends the opposites into a tertiary or a meso state as coexistence. Now, more importantly for Jung, this is done through surrendering one's conscious will to the spontaneous and involuntary forces bubbling within tectonic dynamic relations that end in revelation as symbolic manifestation. This is big for Jung. Hence the transmogrification and appearance of unconscious experience. Jung differentiates a sign, which has a fixed meaning to a signified object, from a symbol as psychic image, that is, as an imago in the mind's eye that expresses an unknown quality or value. Here Jung makes imagistic symbols a sort of quasi-agent with their own life. They guide the process and populate independently of our conscious intention or impose social constructions. In other words, once you suspend control over the method of engagement with one's interior, the symbol qua archetype spontaneously manifests and generates its own meaning. Consciousness must decipher and accept as a production or a corollary that guides the communicability between the opposites. But unification does not necessarily mean reconciliation. This depends upon the degree of opposition that exists between competing forces constituted through dialogue. Opposition may very well end in a stalemate or an impasse where no resolution or unification is made possible. Tearing in the negative is often part of the process until a symbol or complex system of images and interactions emerge from the interchange. We may assume that the practice of active imagination has an epistemological entry into the unconscious, or it wouldn't excavate therapeutic effects. We may further assume that that active imagination serves as a tool or a techne to induce states of transcendence. Now, I started experimenting with active imagination with patients who I thought could profit from entering into dialogue with their inner self states and split off aspects of their personal histories. I find some patients are not particularly good at visualization, especially if their cognitive styles or psychological types are not conducive to producing symbolic imagery. Instead, I found that focusing on dialogue is more aligned with how thought and narrative operate pre-reflexively and in tandem with our sentience, the felt body, unconscious fantasy, and affective moods. Just as Plato reminds us that thinking is a silent dialogue the soul has with itself, conversing with personifications in the mind may directly relate to how the psyche consolidates its dissociated, split off, or compartmentalized contents, as well as self states that have been sequestered to the underworld, awaiting opportunities to resurface or to be engaged by more preconscious ego organizations. Here I wish to stress how these facets, namely dialoguing with personifications, which I have observed, can remarkably provide nearly direct contact with the unconscious. My client was in her mid-30s when she first came to see me and was on disability after being punched in the face at work. The assault excavated her complex traumatic past she had staved off for years, including being emotionally abused and abandoned psychologically by her parents after they divorced, was physically assaulted by her mother on a few occasions during childhood, and was left with this loitering aftermath of feeling unloved and unlovable. I've seen her on and off for 16 years. Terry reports being primarily raised by a borderline mother who herself was abandoned by her parents at the age of 2 and sent to live with an extended family, but was sent back home for reportedly being bad. This is the mother, and this is my client's words. Born in a fundamentalist Christian environment, my patient's mother came to hate her own mother, but identified with her father's rage. In a repetitive pattern, Terry was sent to live with her maternal grandparents after her parents separated when she was 5. There she was taught to fear the devil. Despite her own mother's rebellion against religion, Terry could not escape her harsh superego judgments and the installation of rigid codes of conduct. Terry reports no clear early memories, only screen fragments and gaps with no lucid narratives. She has no memories of her parents being together. When she returned to her mother's home, she was told that her father didn't love her. "Because of you, I am alone," her mother repeated often. This damaged her spirit. Sadness lingers. She has no happy recollections from childhood. Terry masturbated openly from the age of 5 and would often be told to go to her room or was reproached. She fears she was molested, but she doesn't know, nor can she remember. She got into drugs and became promiscuous as a teenager, having had 4 abortions from the ages of 14 through 18. Her teen abortions make her afraid she has offended God. This left a great deal of unconscious guilt and need for punishment, although she has compensated by going into a helping profession involving children. She does not enjoy sex with her husband and much of their domestic life revolves around their children, so she can avoid it. Terry is generally a nervous and dysphoric person who worries and obsesses over little details with a free-floating sense of anxiety that manifests mainly as somatic symptoms, such as a feeling, a knot, that's a constant knot in her stomach. Notice the locus of abortions. After teaching her some active imagination techniques via my examples to facilitate conversation by formulating open-ended, non-judgmental questions, she began to carry on this work independently while alone. Over time, dialoguing with her inner self states, physical feelings in her body, and with a, quote, evil entity in her house, this had gradually led to symptom improvement. Less anxiety, less bodily reactions in her, quote, gut. She realized the more she talked to the images and affects in her mind, the less she felt the need to avoid thinking about negative or frightening events, or memories or fantasies that generally made her anxious and unsafe. After some months of initiating her own active imaginations when alone, Terry told me that her attempt to converse with these personifications or images or feelings allowed her sometimes to let them go or to simply let them be. And this process let her feel less terrified and more safe. Now, in a particularly poignant and moving session, the patient started to free associate to recollections of her early childhood after having, as she put it, deliberately pooped on her parents' carpet. Her mother was so enraged that she put Terry in a car and drove her out to a farm in the country and told her to get out. If you want to act like a cow, then you can live like one, she said before driving off. As Terry revisited this event, she started to identify a bad feeling develop in the pit of her stomach. She recalled the chaotic household she grew up in, marked by her mother yelling all the time, engendering fear that she was constantly on the verge of getting in trouble, as she would put it. In an image of herself as a little girl entered her consciousness, she saw herself sitting in a room on the floor playing alone, but looking away. She called herself, quote, little bad girl. Now, after some time of silence had passed, I said, little bad girl wants you to play with her. Why don't you talk to her? Oh, she replies. After some time had passed, she says, you ask her a question. What would you like, little one? In a languid voice, she moans love, and then she just starts crying. After some time, I say, then find a way to show her love. And this is when she went into like a regressive, almost baby voice, and she says, you're not bad. You only feel that way because your mother put bad feelings in you. Let me give you a hug. And then she starts to sob. And she describes after sitting with her child self in her mind, holding her, rocking her in her arms, reassuring her that she was good and that she loved her, the bad feelings lifted and the knot in her stomach went away. without getting into every detail, months later, looking back at our work together, Terry said how this particular session had special significance for her because she felt she was able to heal a part of her wounded self. Now, admittedly, active imagination, especially captured here, relies on the use of suggestibility by the analyst. But it's the qualitative factor of the lived experience that ultimately counts, as the qualia of transcendence has a transformative power in a numinous engagement with fantasy, image, and affect. This example of the transcendent function at play has both therapeutic benefits of healing as well as generating symbolic value for inducing emotional shifts in internal representations and fixated self states that compensate for this unconscious one-sidedness. By generating a third or tertiary movement in dialectical engagement with her damaged inner child, the patient was able to nurture herself in a maternal manner that her mother was not able to give, hence offering a compensatory self-relation of love and acceptance she found meaningful and gratifying. Although this terse example does not do full justice to the technique or adequately explain therapeutic action, its applied form does engender value for some patients who benefit from this mode of engagement with their interior. And with that, I'll stop there and leave it open for discussion.
Thank you very much, John. That was most interesting. Okay, we're now taking questions. So raise your hands with the reactions. Douglas.
John, wow, thank you so much. So I think I understood every single word that you said. I'm particularly curious about the experience of doing psychotherapy online. Christopher Hawk did a really excellent presentation yesterday about this question of virtual reality versus so-called real reality. And while he was talking, I was really wondering about this aspect of the transcendent function. And in the beautiful case example that you provided, I had such a visceral sense of what it might have been like to be there in the room with her as you and she were encountering the same image and having a reaction to it. I thought that was a really beautiful illustration of what I think of as a field that gets constellated in the room during the therapeutic work. I'm just curious what thoughts you have about online work. Does a similar field get constellated, or is it qualitatively different in some way?
Yeah, thank you, Doug, for that thought. Unfortunately, I don't feel much transcendence when I'm doing therapy online. I mean, I probably feel a little bit better when I lecture. It just doesn't have the same presence, emotionality. I don't feel nearly as connected to people, and we have trouble with my patients. I should say that I only see a few people, and I mainly supervise. The handful of people I see, I've seen, they're my long-term analytic clients, so some like 20 years now. And so we know each other. If I were to start with anyone, it would be awful. And even with the people I've known for so long, one of them lives out in the boonies, and it just doesn't have good Wi-Fi. It breaks up. We have to go to the phone. So I don't particularly think it even remotely comes close to real life. But it's the new game in town, and all of our therapists at our office, I should say, I run a mental health business, mental health corporation in Ontario. Everyone's online, on Zoom or Skype, and there's fatigue over the months now, and now it's a year. So, but we're very fortunate that we have any engagement with people given the pandemic. So that's my meandering response.
I think I might have missed, Robin, you were raising your hand. You're on mute, Robin.
John, I'm interested in what you were describing implicitly shows how the process of working with the transference is co-effective, where you're led to say this, and then the patient does this, and then something in you. I mean, is that your experience? I mean, it wasn't just that you had, a template in which you were then employing active imagination techniques. It seemed more off trail than that, and were the and immediate, where you would respond to something in the immediacy of the moment, moving in and out of altered states of mind, yeah. Whatever we call them, what transcendent, transcendental. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, sure, certainly in that brief example, but in general, I often get images in my mind of what patients are describing, and I'm in there with them.
Yes.
And then I'll even describe it or talk about it or throw it out, and it's amazing how they will pick up on it. It's as if we're thinking the same thing. And these are sometimes, not always, but when we're in the work, when we're in a co-transference or just a attunement. But definitely, I don't work by following a rote step-by-step method, which is fashionable in training these days with CBT and all the other nonsense they teach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Very bad.
Thank you for your paper, John. So enjoyed the thread that you took us through the fabric of these interrelated aspects, and then bringing in the clinical example of this experience. And I just wanted to share with you that the way I've been trained is to actually use this method as well. And so I use it frequently, even online, but I agree with you, in person is so much more felt and gives rise, I think, to such a richer experience. But yeah, to focus in the body, and there's not a prescription, as you say, or a method, but it's just an availability that when it lights up within us, that there's the interior aspect. Often when I feel a blockage or some sense of that, I might say, just, focus inside. Do you have a feeling? And is there a color or a word or an image that arises? And then often use the active imagination to interact with the word or the image. And so frequently, it is the child, the inner child. And so often the child wants to be known, but the adult the person in the room is terrified of the child. And I was just wondering if you've experienced this or any comment about that, but it's like a terror to even know this inner terror and shame and such a mixture of feelings. I don't know if you could speak to that.
Yes. Well, thank you, Mary Beth. It's funny how only in Jungian circles is this active imagination really discussed. It's rather mind-boggling how traditional psychoanalysis is so cleaved off from Jungian thought that it's as if it's a foreign reality to my colleagues when I bring this up to discuss. But getting back to the question, there can be horribly raw moments, as we all know, working with people, and particularly those who have a great deal of developmental traumas. And it just brings back a flood of different people who've had a really difficult time sitting with these self states, whatever you want to call them, but inner representations. Like you said, they're terrified of them. Because they can be plummeted right immediately into their their dissociated or split off or repressed self, and they can be overwhelming, just horribly overpowering, because they feel autonomous, and just like this notion of an archetype as having its own life. And so I appreciate, like a lot of people don't like to talk about their clinical work either. And when they do talk about it, it's always glossed over in a nice little package. Just, boy, that was great. Now, of course, I'm presenting here, so I decided to pick a nice, a more friendly version of this, because it's gone south. And some people I would not recommend it, because it can lead to a regression. Just like when I was taught how to do EMDR and thought, 20 years ago, and I tried this on two of my most traumatized patients, and it was a disaster because it's a flooding technique. And when you flood someone with real graphic images of their abuse, it can lead to disintegration. So we want to be careful with this technique as well. And just on a personal note, when I was first introduced to this therapeutically, it was so powerful that it's like like the core of my unconscious conflicts were all brought together at once. And I was a basket case after this, but it convinced me there's obviously something incredibly powerful, and that's numinous too. To me, that's numinous, even if it's bad. It's like it's a good bad. It's the awe of the awfulness, and so we all have to kind of, I think, experiment with our clients in this way, but using our clinical sensibility and good judgment, because not everybody this is going to be good for.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, I'm bringing it up exactly that it's not negative that those feelings are experienced. And often, to my astonishment, the next time, not necessarily the next session, but the next time we encounter the inner child again, huge on its own progress has been made between the person and the child. Like some kind of a peace has already started, even though initially it was kind of like, oh, I don't know if I could talk to that child, but the progress that happens without even consciously attending to it is phenomenal as well. So thank you so much, John.
Thanks.
Roger.
Thank you. My comment will be just brief, but first of all, I did understand it, John. Thank you. It was incredibly moving what I wanted to say was that many years ago, back in the 1960s, a Jungian analyst called Dorothy Davidson wrote a very beautiful article called The Transference as a Form of Active Imagination. And it speaks so well, I think, to what was happening with you. There was clearly the active imagination that she was doing, but it was only possible because it was also being held and carried in the dialogue between the two of you. When people are so profoundly wounded often who have been truly unloved, active imagination, a lot of us find, is just impossible. It demands too much of them. It's almost like perpetuating the do-it-yourself psychology that has been their torment. Well, you're feeling so miserable. Well, here we've got this technique. You now have a conversation with your own inner child, sort of thing. And yet what is so obvious is that, well, you said you've been with her she's been with you for so many years. There's been this very lovely form of that active imagination being carried between the two of you, over the years, which I think makes it possible. I have found that when I've tried to do active imagination and the person just sort of becomes frozen or disintegrated or something like that, I back off and I realize that it might be years before I can get there again. And it's because it's premature. Thank you.
Yeah, well, very well put, Roger. Yeah, that's why I don't do it for all my clients. It has to feel like it would be, it would fit them. And I would agree that we have to take it slowly. Yeah.
There's still a couple of minutes for some other questions. Michael.
Yes. Hi. Let's ask a question. Would there be a correlation between active imagination or like kind of a style of active imagination and typology? So it was said that the lowest function is more connected with the unconscious. So would it be that this would be the strongest in the active imagination of the person? So I know the image would be the stronger, or the feeling, or a sensation, or something like this. Would there be a correlation in practical cases like this?
I think that's often the case. Some people are better. For instance, if they're not good at symbolizing or getting images or pictures in their mind, because I'm more like that. I'm more rational, so I think in terms of my thoughts, and so I'll have a dialogue, let's say, and that might fit my style. This particular client doesn't have really rich dream material. Sometimes she does, but not much. It's more about feeling states, her gut, sensations, and her affective life. So that's where she tends to feel more at ease in her self-relations. And the inferior function too. We don't know, I suppose, like what's going to rupture in that unconscious when you start to direct someone to get in dialogue or relate to whatever that inner condition might be. We have to be prepared for where that might lead. I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah. This funny correlation, like with the red book, was the Jung's strong function, but his works in stone and wood would be then typologically work with his lower function in this case, for example, as a idea.
Yeah. Well, I'll leave that to you and others to analyze.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. We are now at break time. Thank you, John. That was really interesting. And we're going to upload you.
Beautiful.
Thank you.